I'm Brent Eaton, and thank you for joining me for the Advent Unplugged series. In this series of lessons, we're looking at the people who were involved in the story leading up to the birth of Jesus from the perspective of who they were as real live human beings. When we look at the Christmas story today, we have the advantage of looking back through history at the life and birth of Jesus and see how these people acted according to our time frame. However, they didn't have the advantage of that. They were normal human beings going through normal circumstances of life when God confronted them with the importance of what was about to happen. So by looking at how they acted in their time, it can tell us a lot about who we are and how we can be more of who God wants us to be. If you'd like to download and print the notes for this lesson, they're in the link below. Also, I'd like for you to go back and look at the first lesson on Zacharias, who was the father of John the Baptist. In this lesson, we'll be talking about the lists or the genealogies of Jesus that we find in Matthew and Luke. Oftentimes when we read the Christmas story, we might skip over these names because there's just a lot of them and it's hard to pronounce some of them, and we don't know necessarily what they mean. We'll be talking about the meaning and intent of these genealogies and how they can inform us about who Jesus is. At the end of our lesson, we're going to talk about three things, and I want you to consider these as we go through the lesson. How do you keep from being judgmental about someone you meet? Why are we impatient about God's timing? And how can we be more sensitive to what God is doing in our lives and the lives of others? The lists are important for a couple of reasons, but the main one is it establishes Jesus as the promised Messiah who sits on the throne of David. In Jeremiah 23, 5 and 6, it says this, "Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I will raise to David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name by which he shall be called, Yahweh our righteous." So this establishes David as being the ancestor of Jesus, and that the Messiah would come through his line and sit on his throne. There's a couple other reasons why this is important. It shows Jesus' connection to history, the people in the Old Testament that we read about. In Luke connects Jesus back to Adam, and in Matthew, he connects him back to Abraham. Two completely different reasons why they did this, and we'll talk about that as we go. But it also demonstrates that God can use people that we may see as unusable. There's some people in our lives we think, well, I don't know if this person's really ever going to amount to anything, but God can use them for a special purpose. And these lists, as we look at them, there's a lot of them, and some are hard to pronounce, but they're anything but boring because we see the depth of research and precision behind our Gospels. There's a lot that went into putting these lists together. They weren't random, haphazard, or by accident. They were on purpose. We also see the differences between the personalities and styles of Matthew and Luke. Two completely different people writing for a different purpose, and we'll look at those as we go. First thing we're going to do, though, is look at Matthew's list. And Matthew has some interesting scandals in his list. The first one is the fact he mentions women in the genealogy. In that day and time, in that culture, that wasn't done because the whole purpose of a genealogy was to establish someone's credentials as being a descendant of a particular line or particular tribe. And the line of legal succession always went through the father, not the mother. So the fact Matthew put women into this list, he's telling us something very specific. But the women he chose, 5 of them, all of them had some type of tarnish or scandal attached to their names at that time. And we're going to look at each one of those. And we're going to wait for Mary because she's going to be a whole different lesson next time. Tamar is found in Matthew 1:3. It said, and God killed off her first 2 husbands because they were disobedient. So she didn't have a good track record. But then she ended up pretending to be a prostitute and seduced her ex-father-in-law, Judah. Rahab was a prostitute, but yet she helped Israel defeat Jericho and became part of the Hebrew nation as a hero. Ruth, lovely story. Read the book of Ruth and you'll see that. But she engaged in some risky behavior to get Boaz's attention. And I'll let you read that story and see what you think. But she was significant because she was David's grandmother, and sometimes we don't make that connection. Bathsheba is the one who committed adultery with David. And David had her husband Uriah killed to hide the fact that Bathsheba was pregnant. And that child died immediately after birth. We know it was soon after birth because in that culture, you didn't name a child until the 8th day. There was a ceremony by which you did that. And this child didn't have a name, was never given one, but yet was significant in the story of David and what happened between him and Bathsheba. The significance of Bathsheba, though, is she is Solomon's mother, and sometimes we don't make that connection. But interestingly, though, her name is never mentioned in the genealogy with all the other names. She is only referred to as one who had been the wife of Uriah. Leaving her name out and putting that phrase, had been the wife of Uriah, emphasizes the fact that Uriah was the one who was ordered murdered by David, and it points to David's complicity in the scandal that was attached to that whole story. David didn't come out of this clean. He's mentioned a lot, but still, he has his problems. Mary, as I said, we're going to talk about in the next lesson. She deserves a whole lesson to herself. Matthew shows some incredible precision and interesting ways he puts these names together. In 117, at the end of the list, he said, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14. From David to exile to Babylon are 14 generations, and carrying away from Babylon into the Christ is 14 generations. I have the names here, not going to read them to you, but just kind of point out some things. Abraham to David, 14 names. We see those. David to the exile, 14 names. We see that. Babylon to Jesus, 13 names. But yet Matthew says there are 14. Was this an accident, or was there a message behind it? Babylon to Jesus is missing a name, and that was Jehoiakim, who was so evil that Matthew, by intent, blotted his name out of this list and did not replace him with anybody else. So we have 13 names when he says there are 14 to emphasize the fact that Jehoiakim was intentionally left out. Evil will do that to you. But yet in the list of David to the exile, there are also 14 names, but there were more kings than that. So what happened? Ahaziah, Jehoash, and Amaziah are left out of the list. These three people were the evil offspring of Ahab and Jezebel. And Jewish tradition says that their names were never to be spoken in the nation of Israel. So their sin caused Matthew to leave their names out, and they were never spoken of in polite company in the Jewish nation. But there's also another aspect of Matthew's genealogy that we don't see because we don't understand what he was doing. And it's kind of behind the scenes thing to prove to whoever read it and could understand that Matthew did this list with incredible precision and attention. Matthew uses a Hebrew math principle to show God's design behind these names. In that time, and even today, the Hebrew culture uses letters as numbers to signify something important. And at that time, they didn't have numerals 0 through 9 like we do. They used their letters in the alphabet as numbers. So it was common for them to start adding up the value of a name, and that is called Gematria. Now, Gematria is completely different than numerology, and I want to make that clear. In Gematria, you are adding the names, adding the value of the names to indicate a meaning to that name at that time. Numerology derives a numerical value to predict the future, and those are two completely different things. And Gematria is still discussed and talked about today in the Jewish culture. And Matthew is going for a particular number in the way he does this. And to get that, he even changes the spelling of a couple of names to achieve the number he's looking for. Amon becomes Amos. Asa becomes Asaph. And by spelling those names differently, you get a different calculation. And Matthew did this to show us something. To give you an idea of what Gematria is like, I want to take David and Abraham as examples. In the Hebrew language, there are no vowels in the written language itself. They're all consonants. So if you take David's name, you have a D, which equals 4, the V equals 6, and another D for 4, you get 14. Abraham begins with a consonant that doesn't have any sound attached to it. The only sound it will make is whatever vowel is implied in the way the name is said. So that first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, has no sound to it, and it has a value of 1, being the first letter. The B, or bet, in Hebrew has a 2. R has 20, H has 5, M has 13. You add all those together and you get 41. So David is 14, Abraham is 41, and there's significance in those numbers. David, being 14, overshadows all 3 sets of generations Matthew presents to us, because he says there are 14 in this group, 14 in the second group, 14 in the third group. So that number is indicating that David is the most important name in the entire list, according to him. Also, Abraham, being 41, it's interesting that there are 41 names in Matthew's list, and Abraham, the first one mentioned, equals 41. But I will point out some things that Matthew does from a more holistic perspective. If you look at David and Abraham, David 14, Abraham 41, that's the first group of lists, it calculates to 574. That number by itself is not really critical, but there's some other things to it. If you go from David to the exile, the second part of the list, you're multiplying David 14, Jeconiah 40, and you get 560. Again, not that important yet. In the third group, he does something a little bit different. He sums up all the names that are included in that list, and when he gets to Messiah, the Christ, he indicates that as being 42. Now, Gematria calculation of the word Messiah is forbidden. They're not supposed to do that. So what Matthew did is Messiah was the 42nd name in the 3 groups of 14, even though he left one out. So he takes 42 for the Messiah. And if you sum up all of those names together, you get 588. Still not an important number until you get to this. The entire list, 574 plus 560 plus 588 equals 1,722. If you multiply Abraham, who's 41, Messiah, who's 42, you get 1,722. That's where Matthew is indicating to us this was on purpose, this was intentional, and the names left out were not by accident. There was a reason why he did those. Just a little side note, I thought that was kind of interesting, the way he did the math to show us his precision. Go to Luke's for a little bit. Luke's list is different. He goes in reverse order from Jesus back to God, and says the last part of Adam being the son of God, being of God. And there's 77 names in that entire list that Luke gives us. And according to St. Augustine, who was a prolific writer and theologian in the early Christian church, he says that the number 77 represents the forgiveness of sin. So is Luke using that as a particular intent? We don't know, but that number had significance in his time. Now, many names are different if you look at the list of names in Matthew's list and Luke's list. My contention is that Luke was not following the legal succession of people. He was following the bloodline, and he, being a physician, would understand more about that than a lot of other people. So he's following Mary's line. And the way he does that shows us something interesting in Luke 3:23. And you have to consider Luke was a Greek, writing in Greek, thinking as a Greek person would, and then we translate that into English and lose something in that translation. So I want to point something out. In Greek, there are no parentheses like we would put a parenthetical comment, so they do that a little bit differently. But most of your translations will say, being the son, parentheses, as was supposed, in parentheses, of Joseph. But that really should be translated a little differently, because he says, being a son, parentheses, as was supposed of Joseph, parentheses, of Haley. Now, Matthew's formula is so-and-so begat so-and-so. Luke's formula says that you have a name of the next person. It doesn't say son in all those instances. That son, that the translations put in there, is to make more sense of the word, but the word son is not there. It's only there one time. And it wasn't the son, as was supposed of Joseph. It was a son, as was supposed of Joseph. It's not being definite in saying who the son was specifically, and doesn't necessarily imply that it was Joseph's son. It was a son who was supposedly Joseph's child, but a son of Haley. Now, Haley was not in Matthew's list, and that's why I believe that Luke was looking at Mary's bloodline, and that Haley was Mary's father, and on Mary's side of the family was Jesus' grandfather. If you look at the list, start diverging completely after David's name, and that is significant because David is the common denominator, and the ones previous to that are fairly common until you get there, and then after that it changes. Why? What does this mean? It means that Jesus, the Messiah, is the descendant of King David by blood on Mary's side and by lawful inheritance on Joseph's side. And as far as we know, this is probably the only combination of parents at that time that could fulfill this role, and why Mary and Joseph were chosen by God, not even realizing what was about to happen in their future, who had probably been betrothed to each other since childhood. But God had planned all that so that Mary, a descendant of David, and Joseph, a descendant of David, would be the couple that would be parents of the Messiah. Mary by blood and Joseph because of the legal inheritance. Now, what do we learn from this? What may appear to be mistakes or errors in Scripture are more discernible when we stop imposing our standards and judgments on the Bible. If we look at it from our time here in this century, in this culture, in the way we think, and look back and say, well, they did it wrong because they didn't do it our way. But yet, if you look at it from Matthew's perspective of putting women in a list that he wasn't supposed to, he's going outside of his norms to make a point. And we require perfect precision in descendancy because it's a legal issue. But for them, it was the intent or the purpose of it that they looked at. So we may think they're mistakes or errors, but when we realize how and why they did it, it's for a reason. And as I said, Matthew's genealogy is mathematically precise in the way it's done. The other thing we learn is that God cares for all of us and can use whomever he wills for his purposes. God used people that had made mistakes in their lives, like David. But yet, even though they had flawed character, even though they may have done things that we would consider to be immoral or unrighteous, God can still use those people for a righteous purpose. And just because somebody doesn't appear righteous doesn't mean that God can't use them for a righteous purpose. We see evidence of people who live terrible lives, but yet they influence somebody else who ended up being a believer, and God can use anybody he chooses. Another thing we learn is that we will all leave a legacy. The question is, what kind? If we look at the names that were left out of Matthew's genealogy, they have a legacy, but it was because they were evil. So, how are we going to influence the future generations? We will, but how will we? We also learned that the books of the Bible were written with incredible skill and careful research. Nothing haphazard happened here. It was by intent. God led those people to write the way they did, and they didn't do it just on the spur of the moment. And that God orchestrated the circumstances of Jesus' birth over hundreds of years and thousands of people that were descendants and family and influenced things as they went. And God was moving that line of people to a particular point to point to the Messiah. And we learn from that we don't have to be concerned that God's not concerned about us. God looked at all the details of all the people who are involved in this and used them for a righteous purpose, and God can use us as well. Now let's consider some things that we talked about at the beginning I want you to think about. And learning from this lesson, we can kind of see how this is important. How do you keep from being judgmental about someone you meet? When you go to church or you're going to some place and somebody comes in that just doesn't fit in that crowd, you might feel a little uncomfortable and think, well, do they really need to be here, or are they in the right place? And I've experienced that in my own church because we experienced a tragic fire in our old downtown church. Ended up building a beautiful new building outside of town where the growth of the city was. And we knew that there were going to be a lot of people that may not have felt comfortable in the downtown church with all the history to it, but would come to a place they felt comfortable and invited to. So we retrained all of our members in order to help people that had never been to church before. We changed names. We had a worship center instead of sanctuary. We had commons instead of foyer. So we changed the terminology so that people who were coming to church didn't know what that meant, felt comfortable doing that. And we have people from all walks of life. We have people that you would think would never darken the door of a church who are actively involved and on fire for Jesus. And we can't be judgmental about someone, because when they come into our church, they got there because God led them there. And they want and need to be loved, and we need to love them. So some of the people in Matthew's list were not really lovable people and not people that you would invite to dinner parties, but yet God used them. So we can't be judgmental. And why are we impatient about God's timing? We would like things done on our time frame, but we don't have the story. We don't know what all is involved in what God is doing. We don't know why things happen in the timing that they do, but they do happen. And in the case of the Messiah, God worked over hundreds and thousands of years with all these people to bring about what happened at that moment in history. And it happened at the right time. And so when we get impatient thinking God's not responding the way we want God to, we need to realize that there's something deeper at work here. It's not about us. And how can we be more sensitive to what God is doing in our lives and the lives of others? Well, what we need to do is to realize that God is actively involved and is influencing everyone. The question is, are they responding? So what we need to do is to look at a person and say, this is a child of God that I love, that I care for, and that really needs me to respond to them, needs me to love them and take care of them. And that's what I should be doing. So this is our lesson today. I'd like you to look through the notes and think some more about it. And if you would like to get back with me and learn more about what we're doing at powerloveandmiracles.com, there's a way that you can leave a message for me. And I look forward to seeing you, hearing about you, and finding out more about you, and getting to know you a little better. So stay in touch. I'd like you to subscribe to this channel. You can do that by clicking the subscribe button and get indicators of when we're having new lessons. So look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.